On the whole, I like the DMC reboot, but I have to tear into it because there are turds jammed up in there that should be looked at. Knowing how accessible devs make games these days, my first playthrough was on Nephilim, the default hard difficulty. Upon completion, I watched the taste of that turd out of my mouth with a playthrough of Devil May Cry 4. The DMC reboot was too easy. I wasn't invested in the action. I came back to DMC on the harder difficulties and had a much better time because the greater threat has you more engaged in the action. The problem with the default difficulties is that you have a large amount of tools and nothing that demands the use of those tools. The lack of challenge demands little mental input from the player, which left me disengaged. On Son of Sparta and Dante Must Die, the more demanding enemies require I tune into the on-screen action more and fully use my arsenal. Attacks that I thought superfluous became a core part of my repertoire. My issue with DMC's difficulty is systemic of its design. The game doesn't demand much from the player. Playing on a harder difficulty makes the game more engaging, but that does not rectify the game's design faults. The basic enemy has a really simple attack animation that telegraphs from a mile away and is cannon fodder, never posing a threat on any difficulty. The super telegraphed attack is a problem shared by all enemies. It's important to communicate an incoming attack to the player, but DMC gives you such a large and obvious window to do something about it. The enemies, bosses included, aren't terribly interesting, which is a problem since that's what the player primarily interacts with. There's the generic chunky fellow that the player can only attack from behind, and his equally uninteresting friend you can only attack from the front. The Harpies are a solid enemy encounter as they highlight the DMC reboot's more accessible aerial game. The giant rats are satisfyingly aggressive, but are a nuisance when they show up in different colors. Witches are sort of neat with their shield that they could pop on other enemies. I thought they were annoying until I accidentally discovered that you can snatch their sword projectiles and mess them up. Then there's also the creepy face swordsmen that the game throws at the player, who are awful with how they completely alter the pace of combat. Combat becomes completely reactive. The swordsmen block or dodge all the player's attacks, and you're forced to stand around waiting to either parry their attack or mess them up after their teleporting attack. An experience isn't as rewarding when the obstacles aren't much to overcome, or at least interesting. The foes are only half of the equation for the core gameplay. There are the tools the player is given as a means of interaction, Dante's arsenal. The DMC reboot gives the player a lot of variety for Dante to dispatch foes, and this game makes it more accessible than ever to execute Dante's whole array of techniques. Unfortunately, the game limits the player's expression by frequently putting the player in situations that cut Dante's toolset in half by way of the angel-devil weapon vulnerability dynamic. This limitation to players' freedom of combat is outrageous, egregious, preposterous. The angel-devil binary also creates another issue. There are neutral weapons and neutral enemies. There are blue weapons and blue enemies, red weapons and red enemies. The neutral weapons can attack neutral enemies, but that's it. Blue weapons can attack blue and neutral, red weapons can attack red and neutral enemies. The angel-devil weapon vulnerability dynamic makes the neutral moveset feel superfluous. Devil weapons are better for damage output, angel weapons are better for crowd control. The bases are covered, and the sword isn't necessary for melee, and guns aren't that useful as the player has other options to control space. There's a sense of superfluousness with the angel and demon weapons. There's the one wide-sweeping blue thing, and then there's the other wide-sweeping blue thing. Slow, hard-hitting red thing, and the other hard-hitting red thing. In addition to the aforementioned issues I have with the game, things are generally casualed down from previous installments, though the dedicated dodge button is a very welcome addition. There are looser windows for inputs that's noticeable compared to past games. Redeemingly, the loose combat system allows the player to start an attack sequence with one weapon and finish it with another, but in the face of that dreadful angel-devil weapon vulnerability dynamic, combo creativity gets stifled. The reboot's removal of a hard lock-on, for the most part, it doesn't impede the player, but it certainly makes it harder to prioritize and pursue a specific target in a crowd. Parrying was once tied to a stance and required super tight timing. Parrying is now as simple as attacking at the same time as the enemy. That paired with the game's loose timing, it's too easy to gain sloppy accidental advantages. A staple tool in the franchise is Devil Trigger, and it's dumbed down in this game. It's an instant win button on any difficulty other than Dante Must Die. Its damage buff is obscene compared to past games. Most egregious is how it freezes all enemies and pops them into the air for easy pickings. Previous DMCs had time slowdown, but it was an alternative to Devil Trigger. It was a trade-off, a choice players made. They stripped away some of the tactical depth from the Devil Trigger that existed in previous games. Rather than being a tool for combat, Devil Trigger becomes a brief aside from combat. The DMC Reboot's expansion, Virgil's Downfall, removes a lot of the problems I previously mentioned. It seems like Ninja Theory didn't actually consider the gremlins in their design until after they decided they were finished with the main game. Virgil has a more concentrated toolset than Dante. It didn't feel like there were extraneous moves, as there was no overlap by having extra angelic and demon weapons, and there are moves that actually demand tight timing to execute, which feels gratifying when you pull them off. The DLC's new enemies' quirks are a bit more interesting than the established ones. They removed the vulnerability binary, all enemies could be damaged by all attacks. There's also no annoying swordsman. They gave Devil Trigger tactile options and kept the combat situation live while it was activated. The DMC Reboot's expansion felt like a leaner combat experience than the main game. Virgil's Downfall is more or less how the main game should have been like. If Virgil's Downfall is an indicator as to the future of DMC, then I'd feel better about the franchise being in Ninja Theory's hands.
Fuck you!